Do you think experts can save us? Is there such thing as expertise and experts at something? How do you know if you've achieved it?
I think it's important to acknowledge up front that there's something paradoxical about how we relate to authority, especially within science. And I don't think that paradox is going away. And it doesn't have to be confusing. And it's not truly a paradox. It's just like there are different moments in time. So it is true to say that within science or within rationality generally, I mean, just whenever you're having a fact-based discussion about anything, it is true to say that the truth or falsity of a statement does not even slightly depend on the credentials of the person making the statement, right? So it doesn't matter if you're a Nobel laureate, you can be wrong, right? The last sentence you spoke could be total bullshit, right? And it's also possible for someone who's deeply uninformed to be right about something, or to be right for the wrong reasons, right? Or someone just gets lucky, or there are middling cases where you have like a backyard astronomer who's got no credentials, but he just loves astronomy and he's got a telescope and he spends a lot of time looking at the night sky, and he discovers a comet that no one else has seen, not even the professional expert astronomers. I got to think that happens less and less now, but some version of that keeps happening, and it may always keep happening in every area of expertise, right? So it's true that truth is orthogonal to the reputational concerns we have among apes who are talking about the truth. But it is also true that most of the time, real experts are much more reliable than frauds or people who are not experts, right? And expertise really is a thing, right? And when you're flying an airplane in a storm, you don't want just randos come into the cockpit saying, "Listen, I've got a new idea about how we should tweak these controls," right? You want someone who's a trained pilot, and that training gave them something, right? It gave them a set of competences and intuitions, and they know what all those dials and switches do, right? And I don't, right? I shouldn't be flying that plane. So when things really matter, and putting this at 30,000 feet in a storm sharpens this up, we want real experts to be in charge, right? And we are at 30,000 feet a lot of the time on a lot of issues, right? And whether they're public health issues, whether it's a geopolitical emergency like Ukraine, climate change. I mean, just pick your topic. There are real problems, and the clock is rather often ticking, and their solutions are non-obvious, right? And so expertise is a thing, and deferring to experts much of the time makes a lot of sense. It's at minimum, it prevents spectacular errors of incompetence and foolhardiness. But even in the case of some where you're talking about someone, I mean, people like ourselves who are like, we're well educated, we're not the worst possible candidates for the Dunning-Kruger effect. When we're going into a new area where we're not experts, we're fairly alert to the possibility that we don't, it's not as simple as things seem at first, and we don't know how our tools translate to this new area. We can be fairly circumspect, but we're also, because we're well educated, we're pretty quick studies. We can learn a lot of things pretty fast, and we can begin to play a language game that sounds fairly expert, right? And in that case, the invitation to do your own research, right, is when times are good, I view as an invitation to waste your time pointlessly, right? When times are good. Now, the truth is times are not all that good, right? And we have the ongoing public display of failures of expertise. We have experts who are obviously corrupted by bad incentives. We've got experts who perversely won't admit they were wrong when they, in fact, are demonstrated to be wrong. We've got institutions that have been captured by political ideology that's not truth tracking. I mean, this whole woke encroachment into really every place, whether it's universities or science journals or government, or, I mean, it's just like that has been genuinely deranging. So there's a lot going on that where experts and the very concept of expertise has seemed to discredit itself. But the reality is that there is a massive difference when anything matters, when there's anything to know about anything. There is a massive difference most of the time between someone who has really done the work to understand that domain and someone who hasn't. And if I get sick or someone close to me gets sick, I have a PhD in neuroscience, right? So I can read a medical journal article and understand a lot of it, right? And so I'm just fairly conversant with medical terminology. And I understand its methods, and I'm alert to the difference because because in neuroscience I've spent hours and hours in journal clubs, diagnosing, and analyzing the difference between good and bad studies. I'm alert to the difference between good and bad studies in medical journals, right? And I understand that bad studies can get published, and et cetera, and experiments can be poorly designed. I'm alert to all of those things, but when I get sick or when someone close to me gets sick, I don't pretend to be a doctor, right? I've got no clinical experience. I don't go down the rabbit hole on Google for days at a stretch trying to become a doctor, much less a specialist in the domain of problem that has been visited upon me or my family, right? So if someone close to me gets cancer, I don't pretend to be an oncologist. I don't go out and start reading, in journals of oncology and try to really get up to speed as an oncologist, because one is a bad and potential and very likely misleading use of my time, right? And it's if I had a lot of runway, if I decided, okay, it's really important for me to know everything I can at this point. I know someone's going to get cancer. I may not go back to school and become an oncologist, but what I want to do is I want to know everything I can know about cancer, right? So I'm going to take the next 4 years and spend most of my time on cancer. Okay, I could do that, right? I still think that's a waste of my time.
Mhm.
I still think at the end of those 4 years, I'm not going to be the best person to form intuitions about what to do in the face of the next cancer that I have to confront. I'm still going to want a better oncologist than I've become to tell me what he or she would do if they were in my shoes or in the shoes of my family member. I'm going to I'm not advocating a blind trust in authority. Like if you get cancer and you're talking to one oncologist and they're recommending some course of treatment, by all means get a second opinion, get a third opinion, right? But it matters that those opinions are coming from real experts and not from, Robert Kennedy Jr., who's telling you that, you got it because you got a vaccine, right? It's like, it's just, we're swimming in a sea of misinformation where you've got people who are moving the opinions of millions of others who should not have an opinion on these topics. Like there is no scenario in which you should be getting your opinion about vaccine safety or climate change or the war in Ukraine or anything else that we might want to talk about from Candace Owens, right? It's just she's not a relevant expert on any of those topics, and what's more, she doesn't seem to care, right? And she's living in a culture that has amplified that not caring into a business model, an effective business model, right? So and that there's something very Trumpian about all that. Like that's the problem is the culture. It's not these specific individuals. So the paradox here is that expertise is a real thing, and we defer to it a lot as a labor saving device, and just based on the reality that it's very hard to be a polymath, right? And specialization is a thing, right? And so there are people who specialize in a very narrow topic. They know more about that topic than the next guy, no matter how smart that guy or gal is. And that those differences matter. But it's also true that when you're talking about facts, sometimes the best experts are wrong. The scientific consensus is wrong. You get a sea change in the thinking of a whole field because one person who's an outlier for whatever reason decides, okay, I'm going to prove this point, and they prove it, right? So somebody like the doctor who believed that stomach ulcers were not due to stress, but were due to H. pylori infections, right? So he just drank a vial of H. pylori bacteria and proved that, and quickly got an ulcer and convinced the field that at minimum H. pylori was involved in that process. Okay, so yes, everyone was wrong. That doesn't disprove the reality of expertise. It doesn't disprove the utility of relying on experts most of the time, especially in an emergency, especially when the clock is ticking, especially when you're in this particular cockpit and you only have one chance to land this plane, right? You want the real pilot at the controls.
But there's just a few things to say.
Go.
So one, you mentioned this example with cancer and doing your own research. There's several things that are different about our particular time in history. One, doing your own research has become more and more effective because you can read. The internet made information a lot more accessible, so you can read a lot of different meta-analyses. You can read blog posts that describe to you exactly the flaws in the different papers that make up the meta-analyses. And you can read a lot of those blog posts that are conflicting with each other, and you can take that information in, and in a short amount of time, you can start to make good faith interpretations. For example, I don't know, I don't want to overstate things, but if you suffer from depression, for example, then you could go to an expert and a doctor that prescribes you some medication.
Yeah.
But you could also challenge some of those ideas and seeing like what are the different medications, what are the different side effects, what are the different solutions to depression, all that kind of stuff. And I think depression is just a really difficult problem that's very, I don't want to again state incorrect things, but I think it's, there's a lot of variability of what depression really means. So being introspective about the type of depression you have and the different possible solutions you have, just doing your own research as a first step before approaching a doctor or as you have multiple opinions could be very beneficial in that case. Now, that's depression. That's something that's been studied for a very long time. With a new pandemic that's affecting everybody, it's with the airplane, I would equate it to like 9/11 or something. Like the new emergency just happened, and every expert in the world is publishing on it and talking about it. So doing your own research there could be exceptionally effective in asking questions. And then there's a difference between experts, virologists, and it's actually a good question. Who is exactly the expert in a pandemic?
Yeah.
But there's the actual experts doing the research and publishing stuff. And then there's the communicators of that expertise. And the question is, if the communicators are flawed to a degree where doing your own research is actually the more effective way to figure out policies and solutions, because you're not competing with the experts. You're competing with the communicators of expertise. That could be WHO, CDC in the case of the pandemic, or politicians, or political type of science figures like Anthony Fauci. There's a question there of the effectiveness of doing your research, your own research in that context. And the competing forces there, incentives that you've mentioned, is you can become quite popular by being contrarian, by saying everybody's lying to you, all the authorities are lying to you, all the institutions are lying to you. So those are the waters you're swimming in.
Yeah.
But I think doing your own research in that kind of context could be quite effective.
Let me be clear. I'm not saying you shouldn't do any research, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't be informed about an issue. I'm not saying you shouldn't read articles on whatever the topic is. And yes, if I got cancer or someone close to me got cancer, I probably would read more about cancer than I've read thus far about cancer, and I've read some. So I'm not making a virtue of ignorance and of blind obedience to authority. And again, I recognize that authorities can discredit themselves, or they can be wrong. They can be wrong even when when there's no discredit. There's a lot we don't understand about the nature of the world. But still, this vast gulf between truly informed opinion and bullshit exists. It always exists, and conspiracy thinking is rather often, most of the time, a species of bullshit. But it's not always wrong, right? There are real conspiracies, and there really are just awful corruptions of born of bad incentives within our our scientific processes, within institutions. And again, we mentioned a lot of these things in passing, but what woke political ideology did to scientific communication during the pandemic was awful, and it was really corrosive of public trust, especially on the right, for understandable reasons. I mean, it was crazy, some of the things that were being said, and still is. And these cases are all different. So, like you take depression. We just don't know enough about depression for anyone to be that confident about anything, right? And there are many different modalities in which to interact with it as a problem, right? So there's pharmaceuticals have whatever promise they have, but there's certainly reason to be concerned that they don't work well for everybody, and I mean it's obvious they don't work well for everybody, but they do work for some people. But again, depression is a multifactorial problem, and there are different levels at which to influence it. And there are things like meditation, there are things like just life changes, and one of the perverse things about depression is that when you're depressed, all of the things that would be good for you to do are precisely the things you don't want to do. You don't have any energy to socialize. You don't want to get things done. You don't want to exercise. And all of those things, if you got those up and running, they do make you feel better in the aggregate. But the reality is that there are clinical level depressions that are so bad that we just don't have good tools for them. And it's not enough to tell you, there's no life change someone's going to embrace that is going to be an obvious remedy for that. Pandemics are obviously a complicated problem, but I would consider it much simpler than depression in terms of what's on the menu to be chosen among the various choices.
Just less multifactorial.
The logic by which you would make those choices. Yeah. So it's like we have a virus, we have a new virus. It's some version of bad. It's human transmissible. We're still catching up. We're catching up to every aspect of it.
We don't know how it spreads.
We don't know
how effective masks are.
Well, at a certain point, we knew it was respiratory, but and whether it's spread by fomites, we were confused about a lot of things, and we're still confused. It's been a moving target this whole time, and it's been changing this whole time. And our responses to it have been, we ramped up the vaccines as quickly as we could, but too quick for some, not quick enough for others. We could have done human challenge trials and got them out more quickly with better data. And I think that's something we should probably look at in the future, because to my eye, that would make ethical sense to do challenge trials. But so much of my concern about COVID, many people are confused about my concern about COVID. My concern about COVID has, for much of the time, not been narrowly focused on COVID itself and how dangerous I perceive COVID to be as a illness. It has been, for the longest time, even more a concern about our ability to respond to a truly scary pathogen next time. Like outside those initial months, give me the first 6 months to be quite worried about COVID and the unraveling of society. But
and the supply of toilet paper.
You want to secure a steady supply of toilet paper. But beyond that initial period, when we had a sense of what we were dealing with, and we had every hope that the vaccines are actually going to work, and we knew we were getting those vaccines in short order, right? Beyond that, and we knew just how dangerous the illness was and how dangerous it wasn't. For years now, I've just been worrying about this as a failed dress rehearsal for something much worse, right? I think what we proved to ourselves at this moment in history is that we have built informational tools that we do not know how to use, and we have made ourselves, we've basically enrolled all of human society into a psychological experiment that is deranging us and making it virtually impossible to solve coordination problems that we absolutely have to solve next time when things are worse.